The sound of a hand striking flesh carries farther than any scream. It cracks through stone courtyards. It silences birds. It stops a prince mid-step in a doorway he was never supposed to be standing in. At the exact moment his fiancée's palm connected with the cheek of a girl who mucked out stables for a living. Nobody saw him there. That's the part that matters most. Lady Cassia didn't slap Rosalind because she thought she'd get away with it in secret. She did it because she assumed there was nothing to get away with. A stable girl wasn't a person who counted. A stable girl was furniture that happened to breathe. And you don't apologize to furniture. She was wrong, and by sunset she would understand exactly how wrong, though no one would ever explain it to her face. This is the story of Prince Aldrich, a woman named Rosalind who never asked to be defended, and the quiet, devastating way a powerful man can choose to burn his entire future down without raising his voice once. Let's start at the beginning, because the beginning tells you everything about how this ends. The kingdom of Varel wasn't the kind of place where stable girls and princes crossed paths. Often. The palace was built like a wedding cake, tier after tier of polished marble and gold leaf. And the further down you went, the more the polish wore off, until you reached the stables, where the smell of hay and horse sweat replaced rosewater, and the girl who ran the place had calloused hands and dirt permanently pressed into the creases of her knuckles. Rosalind had worked the royal stables since she was 12. Her mother had worked them before her, and her mother's mother before that. It wasn't a proud lineage in the way the court understood pride. Nobody wrote songs about stable keepers. Nobody remembered their names in genealogies. But horses remembered kindness. And Rosalind had a gift for it that bordered on strange. She could walk into a stall with a spooked stallion that had thrown 3 grooms that week and have it eating from her palm within the hour. The head groundskeeper used to say she talked to them in a language that wasn't words. She was 22 now. Quiet in the way. People are quiet when they've learned that speaking up rarely changes anything for someone in their position. She kept her head down, did her work, and went home to a small room above the stable block that smelled like cedar shavings and leather oil. She didn't dream about the palace. She didn't dream about princes. She had in fact spoken to Prince Aldrich exactly 4 times in her entire life, and every single conversation had been about horses. That's important to understand, because this isn't a story about a secret romance that everyone suspected. This is a story about a man who noticed a person other people had trained themselves not to see. Prince Aldrich was 26, the second son of King Bastien, which in most kingdoms would have made him irrelevant to matters of succession and free to live a quiet life of ceremonial appearances and diplomatic small talk. But Varel's laws were strange, and its recent history stranger. His older brother had died in a hunting accident 2 years prior, an accident that still got spoken about in hushed tones because nobody quite believed it was an accident, though nobody could prove otherwise either. That left Aldrich his heir, a position he had never wanted, training for a crown he'd spent his whole life, assuming would land on someone else's head. He was not a warm man by court standards. He didn't laugh loudly at banquets or throw himself into the performative joy that nobility demanded. He was watchful. He noticed things. Servants liked him because he said thank you and meant it. Guards liked him because he remembered their children's names. The nobility found him a little cold, a little strange, and more than a little frustrating, because he refused to play the games that made court life a game at all. Which brings us to Lady Cassia. Cassia was the daughter of Duke Holloway, one of the most powerful landholders in the kingdom, and her betrothal to Aldrich had been arranged 2 years earlier, shortly after his brother's death, as a way of shoring up the throne's stability with the duke's loyalty and resources. It was a political marriage in the oldest, coldest sense of the phrase. Nobody pretended otherwise. Aldrich had met her exactly 9 times before the engagement was formalized, and each meeting had left him with the same impression. A woman who smiled with her mouth and calculated with her eyes. She was beautiful, in the way marble statues are beautiful, flawless, cold, and utterly still unless someone was watching. And when someone was watching, she performed warmth like an actress who'd memorized her lines but never understood the play. Aldrich had noticed early on that Cassia's kindness had a hierarchy. She was gracious to anyone whose favor mattered. She was invisible to anyone whose favor didn't. Servants who poured her wine got a polite nod. Servants who couldn't offer her anything got nothing at all, not even the courtesy of being seen. He told himself, for 2 years, that this was simply how highborn women were raised, that it wasn't cruelty, just conditioning. He told himself a lot of things to make an arranged marriage feel survivable. He stopped telling himself those things on a Tuesday afternoon in early autumn, in the palace courtyard, when Cassia's open palm cracked across Rosalind's face hard enough to split her lip. Here's what happened. Exactly, because the details matter. Cassia had requested her favorite mare be saddled for an afternoon ride with 2 other noblewomen, a weekly ritual that let them parade through the palace gardens on beautiful horses, while pretending it was exercise and not a performance. Rosalind had done the saddling herself, checking every strap twice the way she checked everything, because she took pride in work that other people considered beneath noticing. But the mare, a normally placid gray named Willow, had a swollen foreleg that morning. Rosalind had caught it during her routine check, a slight heat and puffiness above the fetlock that most people would have missed entirely. She recognized the early signs of a strain that, if ridden on, could turn into permanent lameness. So, she'd made the only decision a responsible stable hand could make. She pulled Willow from the schedule and readied a different horse instead, a calm bay gelding named Pharaoh, explaining apologetically to the stable master that Willow needed rest and a cold compress, not a rider. When Cassia arrived in the courtyard, dressed for her ride, expecting her favorite mare, and found a different horse waiting instead, she did not ask why. She did not wonder if there was a reason. She saw a deviation from what she wanted delivered by someone she'd never bothered to learn the name of, and she reacted the way people react when they've never once in their life been told no. Witnesses said she demanded to know where Willow was. Rosalind, calm as ever, tried to explain the swelling, the strain, the risk of permanent injury if ridden that day. She kept her voice low and respectful, the voice of someone trained since childhood to diffuse, not escalate. She even offered to bring Willow out so Cassia could see the leg herself. Cassia didn't want to see the leg. Cassia wanted her mare, her ride, her afternoon exactly as she'd pictured it, and no dirt-handed stable girl was going to stand in a courtyard and tell her no in front of 2 other noblewomen who were watching to see how she'd respond. So she slapped her. Open, palm-full swing, the kind of strike that isn't about pain so much as about reminding someone of their place. It caught Rosalind across the cheek and split her lower lip against her teeth. The sound of it echoed off the courtyard stones. One of the noblewomen actually gasped, more from shock at the suddenness than any sympathy for the girl who'd been struck. Rosalind stumbled back a step, one hand flying to her face, blood already welling at her lip, and she said nothing. She'd learned long ago that saying something back would only make it worse. What Cassia didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Prince Aldrich had been standing in a shadowed doorway on the far side of the courtyard for the better part of 2 minutes. He'd come down to check on Willow himself, actually having heard from a passing guard that the mare seemed off that morning. He was fond of that horse. He'd been walking toward the stables when he heard voices rising, and some instinct made him slow his approach and stay in the doorway rather than announce himself. He watched the whole exchange unfold. He watched Rosalind explain the injury, with a patience that bordered on saintly. He watched Cassia's face curdle with an entitlement so casual it barely registered as emotion at all, more like reflex. And he watched his fiancée strike a woman who had done nothing but protect a horse from unnecessary pain. He said nothing. Not in that moment. He didn't storm across the courtyard. He didn't announce his presence with righteous fury. He stood very still in the shadow of that doorway and watched, his jaw tightening, his hands curling slowly at his sides, and something in his chest went cold and clear and final. Because here's the thing about Aldrich that the court never quite understood. He wasn't a man who reacted in the heat of the moment. He was a man who decided things quietly, turned them over, made sure of them, and then acted with a permanence that left no room for negotiation. His stillness wasn't weakness. It was the sound of a door closing somewhere deep inside him, one that would never open again. Rosalind didn't cry. That was the detail that stayed with him the longest. She pressed the back of her hand to her split lip, straightened her spine, and said quietly, "I'll bring Willow out for you to see my lady, so you understand. Not an accusation, not even really a defense. Just facts, delivered with a dignity that made the slap look even uglier in retrospect, made Cassia look small, even as she stood there believing she'd asserted her size. Cassia didn't apologize. Of course she didn't. She turned to her companions, said something about incompetent staff needing better discipline, and mounted Pharaoh without another glance at the girl, bleeding quietly in front of her. The three women rode off into the gardens laughing about something already, as though nothing had happened at all. Aldrich stepped back into the shadow of the doorway before any of them could see him. He waited until they were gone. Then he crossed the courtyard to where Rosalind stood, one hand still pressed to her mouth, staring at the dirt like she was trying to remember how to breathe normally again. She startled when she saw him, dropped into an immediate practiced curtsy, mumbling an apology for the scene, as though she was the one who owed something to somebody. "Don't," he said, just that quiet but firm enough that she stopped moving. He asked to see her lip. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the prince of the realm examining her face in the middle of a stable yard. But something in his expression must have told her this wasn't a request she could refuse gracefully. He tilted her chin slightly with two fingers, looked at the split, and his expression didn't change at all, which was somehow more unsettling than if it had. "Get this cleaned," he said, "and send for the physician if it doesn't stop bleeding within the hour." "It's nothing, Your Grace," she said quickly. "I've had worse from a spooked colt." "That's not the point," he said. He didn't explain what the point was. He simply turned and walked back toward the palace, and Rosalind stood there in the courtyard, lip throbbing, utterly confused about what she just witnessed, having no idea that she just watched a 2-year engagement take its final breath. Word of the courtyard incident spread through the palace the way these things always do. Servant to servant, whispered in hallways and kitchens, growing slightly with each retelling. By the time it reached the upper levels of the palace staff, the story had already softened into something more palatable. A minor disagreement, a stable girl who'd been careless with a noblewoman's horse. Nothing worth mentioning to anyone who mattered. Nobody thought to mention it to the king, certainly. Why would they? Noblewomen disciplining servants wasn't news. It happened constantly, in 100 small, cruel ways that the aristocracy considered simply the natural order of things. But Aldrich didn't go back to his chambers to stew or brood or wait for his anger to pass, the way court gossips might have imagined. He went straight to his father's study. King Bastien was a tired man these days, worn down by 2 years of grief he rarely spoke of, and a crown that had settled on his head heavier than he'd ever expected it to. He looked up when his son entered, and something in Aldrich's face must have told him this wasn't a casual visit, because he set down the papers he'd been reviewing immediately. "I want the engagement to Lady Cassia dissolved," Aldrich said. No preamble, no easing into it. The king blinked at him. "Dissolved. Today. Aldrich, you understand what that engagement represents. Duke Calloway's alliance isn't a small thing to walk away from, and certainly not on a whim, and certainly not without." "It's not a whim," Aldrich said, cutting him off, which he almost never did. "I watched her strike a member of our stable staff this afternoon, without provocation, without cause. A girl who had done nothing but keep an injured horse from further harm." The king rubbed at his temples, the particular gesture of a man who'd hoped for an easier afternoon than the one he was getting. Aldrich. Nobility, discipline, servants. It's unpleasant, but it's not unprecedented. And it's certainly not grounds to unravel a political alliance we spent 2 years building. "It's not about discipline," Aldrich said, and here his voice dropped into something quieter and harder than the king had heard from his son in a long time. "It's about what kind of woman she is when she believes no one of consequence is watching. I've spent 2 years telling myself her coldness toward servants was simply upbringing, that underneath it there was someone capable of warmth, of decency, given time. I watched her today, Father. There's nothing underneath. What you see is what exists, all the way down." "And you're certain," the king said slowly, "that this is worth the political cost. Holloway will not take this quietly. He'll see it as an insult to his family, to his daughter, to his house." "Then let him see it as an insult," Aldrich said. "I would rather absorb the anger of a duke than spend my life married to a woman who thinks cruelty is a birthright. I will not build a household, a family, a kingdom's future on that foundation. I won't do it, father. Not for an alliance. Not for anything." There was a long silence in that study. The kind of silence where a father looks at his son and sees, perhaps for the first time, the man he's actually become rather than the boy he remembers. "You witnessed this yourself," the king said finally. "You're certain of what you saw." "I was standing in the doorway the entire time. I saw everything." The king exhaled slowly, some internal calculation shifting behind his tired eyes. "And the girl, the one who was struck, is she all right?" "She will be," Aldrich said. "Though no, thanks to anyone who was supposed to protect her." The king studied his son for a long moment, and something passed between them, unspoken, that felt almost like the first real agreement they'd reached in months. "I'll summon Duke Holloway's steward this evening," he said finally. "We'll frame it diplomatically. Irreconcilable differences. No public fault assigned to either party. It's the only way to prevent this from becoming a war neither of us wants." "I don't care how it's framed," Aldrich said. "I care that it's done today." "It will be done today," the king said, and something in his voice suggested he'd made his own peace with the decision somewhere in the last several minutes, that perhaps he too had noticed things about Cassia he'd chosen not to examine too closely for the sake of convenience. "But Aldrich, understand what you're inviting. Holloway is proud. This will not simply fade quietly into the past. There will be consequences, political ones, and you will bear the weight of them, not just today, but for months, maybe years to come. I understand, do you? Because this isn't a decision you can revisit once it's made. Once this door closes, Aldrich, it stays closed. There's no version of this where you quietly reconcile with Cassia in 6 months once tempers cool. The realm doesn't work that way. Reputations, once broken, don't reassemble themselves." Aldrich looked at his father with a steadiness that had nothing performative in it at all. "Good," he said, "because I don't want it to reassemble. I want it broken, completely today." And so it was. By early evening, a formal letter had been drafted, sealed, and dispatched to Duke Holloway's estate, dissolving the engagement between Prince Aldrich and Lady Cassia Holloway, citing irreconcilable incompatibilities discovered during the course of their courtship. No mention of the courtyard, no mention of Rosalind, no mention of the slap that had started this entire unraveling. Just the polished, careful language of diplomacy, designed to prevent open war between two powerful houses, while still accomplishing exactly what Aldrich wanted, which was distance, total and final, between himself and a woman he no longer recognized any future with. Cassia herself learned of the dissolution before she even returned from her afternoon ride. Stewart met her in the courtyard, the very same courtyard where she'd struck Rosalind hours earlier, and delivered the news with the practiced neutrality of someone who knew this was not a conversation he wanted any personal stake in. Witnesses said she went pale, then furious, demanding to know what had happened, what she had done, who had said what, to whom. The steward, wisely, had no answers to give her. He delivered his message and left before she could turn her anger on him the way she turned it on Rosalind that morning. She never got an explanation. Not that evening, not the following week. Not ever. The formal letter cited only vague incompatibilities. No one from the palace elaborated further, no matter how many times she or her father demanded clarity. It was, in its own quiet way, a kind of mercy that Aldrich extended to her, though she would never recognize it as one. He could have destroyed her publicly. He could have announced to the entire court exactly what she'd done and let public opinion tear her reputation apart syllable by syllable. Instead, he simply closed the door and said nothing further, which left her with humiliation but not total ruin, confusion but not condemnation. Some would call that restraint noble. Others would call it its own kind of cruelty, denying someone the clarity of knowing exactly why their world had collapsed. Aldrich himself never spoke publicly about his reasoning. Not once. Not to anyone outside that study conversation with his father. When courtiers asked, gently probing for gossip, he simply said the engagement no longer served either party's interests, and left it at that, a wall of composure that no amount of curious prying could crack. But here's where the story gets interesting, because dissolving an engagement is one thing. What Aldrich did next is the part that nobody saw coming, including Rosalind herself. 3 days after the courtyard incident, a formal notice arrived at the stable block, addressed not to the head groundskeeper but directly to Rosalind by name, an occurrence so unusual that the entire stable staff gathered around while she opened it, certain it must be some kind of mistake. It wasn't a mistake. It was a summons to appear before the prince in a small receiving room off the eastern wing, an informal space usually used for minor administrative meetings rather than anything resembling court ceremony. Rosalind spent the walk there, convinced she was about to be dismissed. It was the only explanation that made sense to her. She'd caused a scene, however inadvertently, that had embarrassed a noblewoman in front of witnesses. In her experience, servants who embarrassed nobility even through no fault of their own rarely kept their positions afterward. She'd already begun composing, in her head, the letter she'd write to her aunt in the countryside, asking if there might be work available on her small farm. She was wrong about what waited for her. Aldrich received her standing, which itself was unusual. A prince typically expected visitors to approach him. Seated, a small assertion of hierarchy so ingrained in court life that most people didn't even register it as a choice. But he stood when she entered, which threw her off balance more than anything else that had happened in the past 3 days. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into the deep curtsy expected of her, though her voice shook slightly. "If this is about the incident with Lady Cassia, I take full responsibility for any embarrassment caused, and I understand if—" "Please don't do that," he said, and something in his tone was almost pained. "You did nothing wrong. You protected an animal from injury and explained yourself with more patience than most people in this palace would have managed. You have nothing to apologize for and nothing to take responsibility for. I ask you here to apologize to you. Actually, which I understand is not how these things typically work, but I find I don't care very much anymore about how things typically work." Rosalind straightened slightly, confusion plain on her face. "Apologize, Your Grace. For what?" "For not stepping in sooner," he said. "I was in the doorway the entire time. I watched her raise her hand, and I didn't move quickly enough to stop it before it landed. I've turned that moment over more times than I can count in the past 3 days, wondering if I could have crossed that courtyard faster, said something sooner, done anything differently. That would have meant you never had to stand there and take a blow you didn't deserve." Rosalind stared at him, clearly unsure how to respond to a prince apologizing to a stable girl for something that wasn't remotely his fault. "Your Grace, you couldn't have known what she intended. Nobody could have." "That's generous of you," he said. "But I should have known. I'd watched her be cold and dismissive to servants for 2 years and told myself it was nothing worth confronting. I made excuses for her, over and over, because confronting it would have meant confronting what our marriage actually was, underneath the politics. So in a way, my slowness that day wasn't really about the doorway or the distance across the courtyard. It was about 2 years of choosing not to see clearly. I'm sorry for that. You deserve better than to be the moment that finally forced my eyes open." The room was quiet for a long moment. Rosalind, for possibly the first time in her life, found herself without any practiced response for how to navigate a conversation with someone of such rank. "I don't understand what you want from me, Your Grace," she said finally, honestly. "I'm not upset, truly. It was a slap, not a tragedy. I've recovered. My lip has healed. I don't need an apology, and I certainly don't need whatever this is. I know you don't need it," he said. "That's rather the point. You didn't ask for any of this. You didn't ask for protection or apology or attention of any kind. You simply did your work, protected an injured horse, explained yourself with grace under circumstances that would have made most people bitter, and absorbed a cruelty you had no part in causing, without complaint. That's precisely why I felt obligated to make sure you received something better than silence in return." He gestured for her to sit, which she did hesitantly, perched on the edge of the chair like she expected to be told at any moment that this had all been some elaborate misunderstanding. "The engagement to Lady Cassia has been dissolved," he continued, "as of 3 evenings ago." Rosalind's eyes widened. "Because of me?" "Because of what I saw in you and what I saw in her in the same afternoon, standing in the same courtyard," he said. "It would be inaccurate to say it was entirely because of you, because the truth is, I'd had doubts for months that I'd been suppressing for the sake of political convenience. But watching that moment crystallized something I'd been avoiding, facing I couldn't unsee it afterward. I didn't want to. Your Grace, I never wanted to be the reason a political alliance collapsed. Duke Holloway's family, the consequences for the kingdom, none of that is your burden to carry," he said, firmly enough that she stopped mid-sentence. "You didn't ask to be struck. You didn't ask to be witnessed. You didn't ask me to dissolve anything on your behalf. Every choice made after that slap was mine, and mine alone, and I will carry whatever consequences come from it, politically or otherwise. You owe this kingdom nothing further than what you already give it, every single day in that stable. Do you understand me?" Rosalind nodded slowly, though it was clear she was still processing the sheer scale of what she was being told. A prince's engagement, dissolved, in part, because of an afternoon that had cost her nothing but a split lip and a few hours of confusion. It didn't fit into any framework she had for how the world worked, where people of her station simply endured what happened to them and moved forward, unacknowledged, unprotected, forgotten by morning. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" she said finally. "Of course. Why does it matter so much to you? I'm a stable girl. There are 100 stable girls in this kingdom who get treated far worse than a single slap every single day, and nobody dissolves engagements over it. I don't say that to diminish what happened to me. I say it because I don't understand what made this different, what made me different in your eyes." It was a fair question, and Aldrich took his time answering it, choosing his words with the same care he seemed to choose everything. "You're right that this happens constantly," he said. "Servants mistreated by nobility, who believe cruelty is simply a privilege that comes with rank. I've watched it my whole life, and to my shame, done very little to stop it, because stopping it constantly would mean confronting the entire structure I was raised inside of. And that's an uncomfortable, exhausting thing to do every single day. I'm not going to pretend to you that I've suddenly become some crusader for the treatment of every servant in this kingdom. I wish I could say that. It wouldn't be honest." He paused, looking for the right way to continue. "But this moment, this particular afternoon, showed me something I couldn't look away from anymore, which was the exact kind of person I was about to marry, and the exact kind of future I was about to build a household and eventually a throne on top of. If I'd stayed silent, if I'd let that slip past as simply the unpleasant ordinary cruelty of court life, I would have spent the rest of my life training myself to look away from things just like it over and over until looking away became who I was. I refused to become that. Not for an alliance. Not for anything." "So this was about you," Rosalind said quietly. "Not really about me at all." "In part, yes," he admitted. "I won't pretend otherwise. But it doesn't change what's true, which is that you didn't deserve what happened to you, and I wasn't willing to let it pass without consequence, even if the consequence primarily affected my own future, rather than repairing anything for you directly. I know that doesn't undo the slap. I know an apology and a dissolved engagement doesn't heal a split lip or erase an afternoon of humiliation in front of witnesses. But it's what I have to offer, and I wanted you to hear it directly from me, rather than through palace gossip that would inevitably twist it into something else entirely." Rosalind sat with that for a long moment, turning it over. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said finally, "for telling me directly. Most people in your position wouldn't have bothered. Most people in my position wouldn't have needed to," he said, "because most people in my position never would have been standing in that doorway to begin with. That conversation should have been the end of it by any reasonable expectation. A prince apologizes to a stable girl, explains his reasoning, and both parties return to their respective lives. forever changed by a single autumn afternoon, but with no further reason to intersect. That's how these stories usually end in the world Rosalind had been raised to understand. Nobility and servants brushed against each other occasionally, and then the current of ordinary life pulled them back into their separate channels, never to meaningfully cross again. But word of the meeting, quiet as it had been, eventually found its way through the palace anyway, the way all things did. Not the details, not the specific conversation, but the fact of it. A stable girl, summoned personally by the prince days after his engagement, collapsed. It didn't take long for the whispers to assemble themselves into a story, as whispers always do, regardless of whether the story they assemble bears any resemblance to the truth. The version that spread through the servants' quarters was almost sweetly hopeful. A secret romance, blooming in defiance of rank and propriety. The prince, finally, free to pursue his true feelings now that the political engagement had been dissolved. Rosalind heard this version from one of the kitchen maids within a week and found it almost laughable if it hadn't also made her deeply uncomfortable. She had no illusions about what she was to Aldrich. A moment of conscience, a person he'd wronged through inaction and wanted to make some small amends for. Nothing more, and certainly nothing resembling romance. The version that spread through the upper court was crueler, as these things tend to be when filtered through people who've spent their lives protecting hierarchies. That version painted Rosalind as some kind of calculating opportunist who had somehow engineered the entire courtyard incident to draw the prince's attention and manufacture sympathy in hopes of climbing beyond her station. It didn't matter that this made no logical sense, that Rosalind couldn't possibly have known Aldrich would be standing in that doorway, couldn't have staged Cassia's cruelty, couldn't have predicted any part of what unfolded. Logic rarely slows down a rumor that flatters the prejudices of the people spreading it. Duke Holloway, for his part, was incandescent with rage once the broader shape of events reached him, though even he never learned the specific details of the courtyard incident. He knew only that his daughter's engagement had been dissolved abruptly, without satisfying explanation, and that rumors now swirled about the prince's sudden, inexplicable interest in a servant girl from the stables. He demanded an audience with King Bastien, which was granted, though it accomplished very little beyond confirming that the dissolution stood and would not be reconsidered under any circumstances. The political fallout was real, just as the king had warned it would be. Duke Holloway withdrew several trade concessions he'd previously extended to the crown. He began subtly at first, and then less subtly, aligning himself with other noble houses who'd always found King Bastien's rule slightly too lenient, slightly too willing to bend old traditions. It created friction in the royal council that would take months, possibly years, to fully repair. Aldrich had known this was coming, had accepted it as the cost of his decision, but knowing something intellectually and feeling its weight arrive in practice are two very different experiences, and there were difficult weeks that followed where he wondered, quietly, whether he'd been reckless rather than righteous. He never regretted the choice itself. But he learned quickly that righteous choices rarely arrive without cost, and anyone who tells you otherwise has never actually made one. Rosalind, meanwhile, found her own life had shifted in ways she hadn't anticipated and didn't particularly want. The stable staff treated her differently. Now, some with a new deference that felt uncomfortable, as though they expected her to suddenly develop airs she'd never had. Others treated her with a cold suspicion, wondering what she'd done to attract royal attention, assuming, as court gossip had primed them to assume, that she must have manipulated the situation, somehow for personal gain. She considered more than once simply leaving, writing that letter to her aunt after all, taking a quieter position somewhere far from palace gossip, somewhere she could simply muck out stalls and tend to horses without becoming the subject of speculation she'd never invited and didn't want. She might have done exactly that if not for a conversation that happened almost a month after the initial incident, one that changed the trajectory of things again in a direction nobody, including Rosalind herself, had anticipated. Willow, the mare whose swollen leg had started this entire chain of events, had healed well under Rosalind's care, the strain resolving completely with rest and the cold compresses she'd insisted on from the beginning. Aldrich had taken to visiting the stables more frequently, in the weeks following the engagement's dissolution, ostensibly to check on Willow's recovery, though the staff had begun to suspect there was more to these visits than equine wellness checks. During one such visit, he found Rosalind alone in the stable, brushing down a different horse entirely, her movements slow and thoughtful in a way that suggested her mind was somewhere else, working through some problem she hadn't quite solved yet. "Tss. You're troubled," he observed, leaning against the stall door. It wasn't a question. She glanced up, startled slightly, then returned to her brushing. "It's nothing worth your Grace's attention. I've found that people say that, specifically when something is worth attention," he said. "What's on your mind?" She was quiet for a long moment, deciding whether honesty was worth the risk. "The other staff," she said finally, "they look at me differently now. Some of them think I engineered all of this somehow, that I orchestrated a scene to gain your favor. Others think I've become someone I'm not, simply because you spoke to me once in a receiving room. I've worked in this stable since I was 12 years old, Your Grace. I've never wanted anything beyond it. And now, I don't know how to go back to simply being someone who works here, because everyone around me has decided I'm something else entirely, something I never asked to become." Aldrich considered this for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "That's another consequence of that afternoon I didn't fully anticipate, and it's another one you didn't ask for." "I'm not looking for another apology, Your Grace," she said, a little more sharply than she probably intended, though he didn't seem to mind. "I'm looking for my life to go back to what it was before a slap in a courtyard turned it into something people can't stop talking about." "I don't know that I can give you that," he admitted. "I wish I could. But rumors have their own momentum once they start, and I don't have the power to simply command an entire palace to stop speculating about something they find interesting. Then what am I supposed to do?" He was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same seriousness he seemed to bring to everything. "You could leave," he said finally. "If that's genuinely what you want, I'll make sure you have a generous position waiting somewhere else, somewhere far from palace gossip, with better pay and better conditions than you have here. You'd want for nothing, and no one there would know anything about a courtyard incident or a dissolved engagement. You could simply be a woman who's very good with horses, which I understand is closer to what you actually want to be known for." Rosalind looked at him carefully, surprised by the offer, surprised by how seriously he seemed to have already considered it before she'd even asked. "But," she said slowly, sensing there was more. "But," he agreed, "you could also stay. And let the rumors run their course, which they will, eventually, because palace gossip always finds a newer, shinier scandal to fixate on within a few months. You could stay in a place where you've built an entire life, where you're genuinely skilled at what you do, where Willow and every other horse in this stable trust you in ways they don't trust most of the staff. The discomfort would be temporary. Painful, certainly, for a while, but temporary." "And which would you prefer?" she asked, that immediately looked like she wished she could take the question back, as though it presumed some right to his preference that she didn't actually have. He didn't seem bothered by it. "I think that's not a decision that should factor in what I'd prefer," he said carefully. "This is your life, and you should build it according to what you want, not according to what would be convenient or comfortable for anyone else, myself included. I only wanted you to know both doors are genuinely open, and that whichever you choose, you'll have my support in making it happen." She thought about it for several days, actually turning the decision over, the way she turned over most decisions in her life, slowly and carefully, without rushing toward relief, simply because relief was available. In the end, she stayed. Not because of Aldrich, though his offer of support had mattered more than she probably admitted even to herself. She stayed because she'd realized during those days of deliberation that leaving would mean the rumors won. It would mean the cruelty and gossip and the small-minded speculation of people who'd never bothered to actually know her had successfully driven her out of a life she built with her own 2 hands since she was 12 years old. She wasn't willing to give them that victory. The horses needed her. Willow, in particular, had grown attached to her in the specific stubborn way horses do, and she found she couldn't imagine handing that mare's care over to someone else simply because other humans couldn't stop talking. So she stayed and endured the whispers and slowly, over the following months, watched them fade exactly as Aldrich had predicted, replaced eventually by newer scandals, newer gossip, newer subjects for the court's endless appetite for speculation. Within half a year, most of the palace had genuinely forgotten the specifics of what had happened that autumn afternoon in the courtyard. It became at most a vague footnote, something about the prince's broken engagement and a stable girl, the details fuzzy, the drama long faded. Aldrich's political situation took longer to stabilize. Duke Holloway remained cold toward the crown for the better part of a year, and it took careful diplomatic work, patient negotiation, and no small amount of concession on other fronts to repair the relationship enough that it stopped actively damaging the kingdom's internal politics. Aldrich never once suggested, even privately, that the cost hadn't been worth it. He absorbed the political consequences the way he'd told his father he would, without complaint, without regret, treating it as simply the bill that had come due for a decision he'd made with clear eyes. He never pursued Rosalind in the romantic sense that palace gossip had once speculated about. That would make for a tidier story, perhaps. The kind where the prince and the servant girl eventually marry against all odds and everyone lives happily ever after, in defiance of the class structures that tried to keep them apart. But that's not what happened, and it's worth being honest about that. Because the truth here is more interesting than the fairy tale would have been. What happened instead was quieter and, in its own way, more remarkable. Aldrich simply continued treating Rosalind, and by extension, every servant in the palace, with the same attentiveness he'd shown that afternoon in the receiving room. He began actually learning the names of stable hands, kitchen staff, groundskeepers, people whose names nobility typically never bothered to learn at all. He started noticing, really noticing, the small cruelties that had always existed in the background of palace life. The casual dismissiveness nobility extended toward anyone who couldn't offer them anything in return, and slowly, incrementally, he began correcting it, not through grand gestures or public proclamations, but through the accumulated weight of 1,000 small choices, made consistently over years. He implemented, quietly, a formal channel through which any palace servant could report mistreatment by nobility, guaranteed anonymity, guaranteed that complaints would actually be investigated rather than dismissed. It wasn't a perfect system. Old habits and hierarchies don't unravel overnight, simply because one prince decides they should. But it was a start, a genuine one, born directly from an autumn afternoon when he'd watched a woman get struck for the crime of doing her job well, and realized how many similar moments must have happened before, unwitnessed, unaddressed, simply absorbed into the ordinary background noise of how the world worked. Rosalind, for her part, became something of an unofficial voice for the stable staff, and eventually for servants more broadly, not because she sought that role, but because people began trusting her judgment, began coming to her when they had grievances they didn't know how else to raise. She never asked for that responsibility either, much like she'd never asked for Aldrich's protection in the first place. But she carried it the same way she carried everything, with quiet competence and an unwillingness to complain about burdens that others had decided to place on her shoulders. 5 years passed this way. Aldrich eventually did marry, though not Rosalind, and not anyone chosen primarily for political advantage either. He married a woman named Alara, a scholar from a minor noble house who'd caught his attention not through beauty or status but through a genuine sharpness of mind and, notably, a kindness toward servants that Aldrich had learned through hard experience to watch for very carefully before letting himself consider anyone seriously. Their marriage wasn't dramatic or storybook in nature. It was simply solid, built on mutual respect rather than performance, which was exactly what Aldrich had decided in that courtyard years earlier that he actually wanted from a life partner. Rosalind eventually became head of the royal stables herself, the first woman to hold that position in the kingdom's recorded history, a promotion that came entirely on the merits of her work, rather than any lingering association with the prince who'd once dissolved an engagement partly on her behalf. She trained a new generation of stable hands with the same patience she'd shown Willow all those years ago, and she never spoke publicly about the courtyard incident, not because she was ashamed of it, but because she genuinely didn't consider it the most important thing that had ever happened to her. It was simply the moment that had by chance revealed who everyone around her truly was, underneath the roles they usually performed. Lady Cassia, meanwhile, eventually married into another noble house. A marriage that court gossip suggested was even colder and more transactional than her almost engagement to Aldrich had been. She never learned the true reason her engagement had collapsed. She spent years constructing her own explanations, most of which conveniently avoided any examination of her own behavior that autumn afternoon. Perhaps that ignorance was its own kind of punishment, or perhaps it simply meant she never had the opportunity to learn anything from the experience at all, and continued moving through the world exactly as she always had, cruel to anyone who couldn't offer her something in return, blind to the fact that this cruelty had once cost her a crown. Duke Holloway, in his final years, was heard to remark once, at a private dinner, that he'd never fully understood why the engagement had ended, and that the not knowing had bothered him more than almost any other political setback he'd experienced in his long career. He'd built entire theories, discarded them, built new ones, and never once considered that the truth might simply be smaller and more human than any grand political conspiracy he'd imagined, that his daughter had simply been cruel to the wrong person in front of the right witness, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon that nobody involved had expected to matter at all. And that, in the end, is the quiet heart of this entire story. Not a fairy tale romance, not a dramatic public reckoning. Just a moment, small and specific and easy to overlook, where one person chose to see someone the world had trained itself not to see, and chose to act on what he'd witnessed with a permanence that cost him real, tangible things. He never asked for gratitude. He never even really got closure with Cassia, who went to her own grave decades later, still slightly resentful and entirely unaware of what she'd actually done wrong. And Rosalind never asked for any of it in the first place. She never wanted to be a cause, a symbol, or a turning point in anyone's story. She simply wanted to do her work well and be treated with the basic dignity that should have been automatic and wasn't. That's precisely why it mattered. Not because she demanded it, not because she fought for it, not because she positioned herself to receive it. Because a decent man was standing in a doorway at exactly the wrong moment, or perhaps exactly the right one. And he refused, afterward, to pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen. There's a version of this story where Aldrich stays quiet, where he tells himself, the way people so often do, that it's not his place to interfere, that political alliances matter more than one servant's split lip, that Cassia's behavior is simply how things have always been and always will be. That version of the story is far more common than the one that actually happened. It's the version that plays out in palaces and courtyards and quiet corners of the world every single day, largely unnoticed, because the people with power to intervene decide again and again that intervening costs more than it's worth. Aldrich decided differently. Once on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and an entire kingdom's history bent slightly around that decision, in ways so subtle most people never noticed the shift at all. No monuments were built. No ballads were written, not really. Not the kind that survive centuries. Just a quiet, cascading series of choices, each one smaller than the last, that eventually added up to a stable girl becoming the head of the royal stables, a prince becoming a king who actually noticed the people beneath him, and a kingdom, slowly, imperfectly, becoming a slightly kinder place than it had been before. It started with silence, not the silence of complicity, but the silence of a man watching carefully, gathering the full weight of what he was seeing before he moved. And it ended, hours later, with a door closing quietly and completely, on a future built on cruelty he could no longer pretend not to recognize. Rosalind never asked for his protection. That's exactly why he gave it. Not as a debt to be repaid, not as an obligation performed for show, but as the simplest, clearest expression of a man deciding, in one ordinary afternoon, exactly what kind of person he intended to become, and exactly what kind of world he was no longer willing to quietly accept. And if there's a lesson in it, buried underneath the courtyards and crowns and quiet dissolutions, it's probably this. The measure of someone's character isn't found in how they treat people who can do something for them in return. It's found in how they treat the people who can't. Cassia never understood that. Not once, not for the rest of her life. Aldrich understood it in a single afternoon, watching from a doorway, and he spent the rest of his life making sure he never had to relearn it the hard way again. That's the story, not a fairy tale. Just an ordinary Tuesday, an open palm, a split lip, and a man who happened to be standing exactly where he needed to stand, choosing for once not to look away.